December 1942. The morning sky burns orange as the rising sun spills across endless blue water. A formation of Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros cuts through the clouds, sleek, fast, and confident. Below them, far to the south, dark specks crawl across the horizon. American bombers. Their leader gives a sharp command over the radio. Engines roar. The Zeros dive. The target, a lone Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, straggling behind its formation. Tracer rounds streak through the air. The Zero pilots grin as streams of 7.7mm bullets spark harmlessly off the bomber's fuselage. They expect it to explode in seconds. Like every other American aircraft they've shredded in the skies over the Pacific. But this one doesn't burn. Its tail is shredded. One engine coughs black smoke. Yet the bomber stays level, lumbering forward, returning fire with cold, mechanical precision. Gun turrets blaze from every direction, arcs of light cutting through the sky. A Zero bursts into flames. Another spirals into the sea. Inside the B-17, the crew bleeds, prays, and keeps firing. The Japanese radio chatter grows uncertain. And high above the ocean, one question begins to echo. Why won't it fall? By the time Japan's fighter pilots first encountered the B-17, the Pacific War was already raging with unrelenting intensity. Pearl Harbor had been struck a year earlier, on December 7, 1941, a surprise that shattered the illusion of American invincibility. Japan's air arm, led by its naval aviation, dominated the Pacific. The Mitsubishi A6M0, fast, agile, and deadly, was the symbol of that dominance. In contrast, the Americans were still reeling. Their aircraft were scattered across the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway, outdated and underprepared. The first months of 1942 were a humiliating retreat. But hidden within the chaos, a new machine had begun to make its mark. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine heavy bomber designed not for speed or agility, but for endurance and punishment. It was conceived in the mid-1930s, when Boeing engineers believed that the next war would be won by range, altitude, and precision. Unlike other bombers of its time, the B-17 was built like a tank that could fly. It carried armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and, most important of all, defensive gun turrets covering almost every angle of approach. To Japanese pilots trained to strike fast and disengage, the B-17 seemed like an absurd creation. It was slow. It was bulky. It looked to them like an easy kill. Early encounters reinforced that belief. In the skies over the Philippines and Java, Japanese Zeros shot down American bombers with surgical precision. Their 20mm cannons ripped through unescorted B-17s, and the myth of the Flying Fortress appeared laughable. Yet the Americans learned quickly. Each failure was studied, each crew debriefed, and Boeing began upgrading the bomber's armor and guns with ruthless efficiency. By mid-1942, the B-17E had emerged, heavier, stronger, and deadlier. It was no longer just a plane, it was a statement. America would not be beaten easily. As 1942 turned into 1943, the balance of air power in the Pacific began to shift. Japan's early war victories had stretched its supply lines thin. Fuel shortages grew. Its best pilots were fighting nearly every day, often without rest, while new recruits received rushed training. Meanwhile, the United States was entering full industrial mobilization. Boeing's factories in Seattle and Wichita worked around the clock. Every day, a new B-17 rolled off the assembly line. By the end of 1942, over 1,000 Flying Fortresses were in service. These bombers weren't confined to Europe. In the Pacific, they flew from bases in Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, striking deep into Japanese-held territory. Their targets: shipping convoys, airfields, and troop concentrations. At first, Japanese pilots still laughed. They would approach in groups expecting an easy kill. But then came encounters that defied logic. Pilots reported bombers that absorbed hundreds of hits, losing engines, wings riddled with holes, control cables severed, and yet somehow stayed aloft. Japanese after-action reports began to include a strange new tone: disbelief. A 1942 Imperial Navy pilot's diary entry captured it best. The American heavy bomber does not die like other planes. We hit it and it bleeds fire, but it will not die. It fights until the sky itself turns against it. The Flying Fortress was becoming a legend. Not because it was invincible, but because it refused to die. And soon Japan would learn just how much punishment one machine, and the men inside it, could endure. Inside B-17, life was measured in minutes. Each mission meant climbing to altitudes where the air was thin and the temperature dropped below freezing. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines filled the fuselage, and the smell of oil and gunpowder was constant. 9 or 10 men were packed inside: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 5 gunners. Each had a role that depended entirely on the others. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. Many were barely 20 years old, college students, farmers, mechanics. But once inside the fortress, they became a living machine of discipline and survival. When enemy fighters approached, the crew's voices vanished into the drone of intercom static. Orders were given with calm precision: tail gunner ready, top turret ready, open bomb bay doors. Every heartbeat was synchronized with the metallic rhythm of the engines. They had seen what happened to those who didn't make it back: bombers returning with wings in tatters, landing gear gone, sometimes with entire crew members missing. And yet they flew again. Because deep down, every man inside that steel cage knew that if they didn't, someone else's brother would have to. In 1942, Japanese air doctrine revolved around the attack. The A6M0 was designed to strike first, strike fast, and never be hit. Its paper-thin armor and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks made it a deadly but fragile weapon. A Zero pilot who misjudged his attack often didn't live to regret it. Against light American fighters or bombers, this doctrine worked flawlessly. But the B-17 was a problem. Its strength lay not in maneuver but in formation. A group of 12 B-17s flying in a box formation could cover every angle with interlocking fields of fire. Any Zero that approached from the rear faced 5 or 6.50 caliber guns at once. Even if it made it through, it still had to endure the chin, dorsal, and waist gunners, all waiting, tracking, calculating. Japanese pilots learned that frontal attacks were suicide. Side approaches were no better. The only semi-safe angle was from below, but that required climbing underneath a falling bomb load. Tactically, the fortress had created something new: a flying fortress city where every crewman was both soldier and shield. And in the wide skies of the Pacific, that changed the rules of aerial warfare forever. The B-17 was more than aluminum and rivets, it was an engineering revolution. Its designers believed that survival was a form of offense. Every major system on the aircraft was built with redundancy. Hydraulic lines were doubled. Electrical systems were looped. Even if one engine failed, sometimes 2, the bomber could still limp home. The armor plating around critical sections, combined with self-sealing fuel tanks, made it astonishingly resilient to machine gun fire. .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, mounted in powered turrets, gave it teeth that no bomber had ever possessed before. Where most aircraft had blind spots, the B-17 had coverage. Where others burned, it absorbed. Where others fell, it flew. This wasn't just design, it was doctrine. Boeing and the U.S. Army Air Forces were betting that technology plus teamwork could overcome raw speed and maneuverability. And in the Pacific, that gamble began paying off. At first, Japanese pilots saw the B-17 as a joke. They called it the flying turtle. But after months of watching it survive impossible damage, that laughter turned to frustration, and eventually to fear. Pilots began describing it as inhuman. They believed its armor was enchanted, its crews unkillable. Each engagement seemed to reinforce the myth. Even when a fortress was finally shot down, it often did so in defiance. Engines flaming, guns still firing, falling in slow, stubborn arcs. For the Americans, this had the opposite effect. The more punishment their bombers took, the more legendary their courage became. Every crew that limped home with bullet holes the size of fists turned into a symbol of resilience. By 1943, the Flying Fortress was more than a weapon. It was a psychological equalizer. A reminder to every pilot in the Pacific that even against superior numbers and speed, sheer endurance could win the day. March 3, 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It was supposed to be a routine strike. Japanese convoy, 8 transports escorted by 8 destroyers, sailing from Rabaul to La. Their mission: deliver reinforcements to New Guinea. Overhead, American bombers gathered, B-25s, A-20s, and among them the heavyweights, B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bomb Group. The air vibrated with the thunder of engines. At 7,000 feet, the first wave of B-17s appeared. Below them, Japanese anti-aircraft fire blossomed in black bursts. The bombers pressed on. Then came the Zeros, screaming down from the clouds, their wings flashing in the sun. They tore into the formation with practiced precision, concentrating on a single B-17 near the center. Machine gun fire hammered the bomber's fuselage. Holes appeared across its wings. An engine burst into flame. Inside, the intercom crackled, "Engine 2 out." hydraulic pressure dropping. But the pilot, Captain J. Zemer Jr., held course. The bombardier lined up the target. The bomb bay doors opened and 500-pound explosives fell like iron rain toward the sea. Seconds later, the water erupted in towers of fire. A Japanese transport was hit amidships, breaking in half. But the Zeros were relentless. They circled back, strafing again and again. The B-17's gunners fought until the barrels of their guns glowed red. When the smoke cleared, the convoy below was chaos. Ships burning. Planes spiraling. And somehow the battered B-17, engines sputtering, tail shredded, turned south toward home. Zemer's crew counted over 200 bullet holes in the fuselage. 2 engines were gone. The rudder controls were shot away. The tail gunner was dead, the radio operator critically wounded. Still the plane refused to fall. For 2 more hours, it limped across open sea, chased by Japanese fighters, buffeted by wind and blood loss. At one point, the co-pilot looked back and saw daylight through the floor. But Zemer just gripped the controls tighter. When the bomber finally reached its base at WWII, the runway was barely long enough. The landing gear collapsed on impact. The B-17 skidded to a halt in a cloud of dirt and smoke, silent, broken, but home. The ground crews stood in stunned silence. The bomber's wings looked like lace. Its fuselage was torn nearly in half. And yet, against all logic, it had brought its men back. Reports of that flight spread quickly, not just through American lines but across the Pacific. Japanese pilots who had attacked the formation that day told their superiors, "We hit it again and again. It should have fallen. But it kept flying." From that day forward, even veteran Japanese aces treated the B-17 with wary respect. It was no longer a lumbering target. It was something else entirely, a fortress that flew. The psychological impact of the B-17's resilience was profound. American morale soared. Newspapers at home printed photos of bombers riddled with holes yet returned safely, dubbing them flying miracles. Each story added to the legend. In contrast, Japanese confidence began to waver. Their pilots realized that speed and skill meant little against a machine designed to survive what should have been fatal. The U.S. Army Air Forces capitalized on this. They doubled down on daylight precision bombing, a strategy that demanded bravery but also broadcast American industrial might. Every bomber that took off carried not just bombs but a message: you can't stop us all. Tactically, Japan began adapting. They tried heavier armaments, including 20mm and 30mm cannons, and new interception tactics involving head-on attacks. But even these were costly. A frontal approach against B-17 meant diving straight into the crosshairs of its forward guns, a death sentence for many. And as the war dragged on, Japan's irreplaceable veteran pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Each dogfight, each bomber run chipped away at their air power, and at their belief in inevitable victory. By 1944, the tide had turned completely. The U.S. introduced the B-29 Superfortress, a descendant of the B-17, capable of flying higher, faster, and farther. All lessons learned from the battles fought over the Pacific. The Japanese air arm, once invincible, was now depleted. Its remaining aircraft were often outdated, its pilots undertrained. Desperation took hold. Kamikaze tactics, suicide missions, emerged not from strategy but from hopelessness. The legacy of the B-17 had become something greater than technology. It had demonstrated that resilience could outlast speed, that discipline could outfight bravado, and that human endurance could turn metal into myth. When the war ended in August 1945, the Flying Fortress had flown over 290,000 missions worldwide. Nearly 5,000 were lost, but tens of thousands of men came home because those machines refused to quit. And for every Japanese pilot who once mocked the slow, heavy American bomber, the memory of those encounters remained, a humbling reminder that courage and engineering could create something almost alive. In the cold light of history, the B-17 Flying Fortress stands as more than a machine. It was the embodiment of persistence, an aircraft that mirrored the resolve of the nation that built it. For the men who flew it, it was both coffin and sanctuary. A roaring, shaking, bullet-riddled cage that somehow always seemed to find its way home. For those who fought against it, it was a lesson in humility, that no matter how skilled, how fast, or how fierce, there are some enemies that simply endure. The Japanese pilots who once mocked it would later admit a reluctant respect. They had seen it burn and still fight. They had watched it fall apart and still fly. The Flying Fortress was never invincible. But in a war defined by destruction, it became something far rarer, a symbol of survival. When historians speak of courage, they speak of men. When engineers speak of endurance, they speak of design. But when both meet, when flesh and metal refuse to surrender together, history remembers. And high above the Pacific, in memories and legends, one question still drifts through the clouds. Why wouldn't it fall?